And in addition to that, the efforts they're doing with Indigenous populations, First Nations, is actually a direct assault now on private property rights. It's really quite something to see how this is changing in the province. And people are waking up and looking and thinking, wait a second, what's really going on here?
Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. Earlier this year, the BC NDP proposed unprecedented changes to the BC Land Act. Conservative Party of BC leader John Rustad told Jordan Peterson that these proposed changes are a direct assault on private property rights. Other critics say the changes threaten BC's agriculture and natural resource industries, including mining and forestry. A senior fellow at the Fraser Institute said that it would bring our province to its knees. Now, BC Premier David Eby postponed the proposed changes, saying the province would do more public consultation. But what exactly is being proposed? Here to explain whether or not property rights are at stake in the upcoming provincial election is a senior editor at the Narwhal and a contributor to the Walrus and Maclean's magazine, a VANCOLOUR fan favorite. She is Michelle Cyca. And this conversation is brought to you by Pacific Sands Beach Resort in Tofino, laid-back luxury, as beachfront as it gets. So Michelle, let's just start at the beginning. What changes to BC's Land Act are actually being proposed by the BC NDP?
So the proposed changes, there's kind of one that has stuck for people. So the BC Land Act is what kind of governs the use of Crown land, which is 95% of the province is so-called Crown land.
And it's owned by the province collectively.
Exactly.
We own it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we own it. So that includes things like parks. It includes industry on public land. Basically, almost all of the land in BC is considered Crown land. There's 5% that's privately owned. And in 2019, BC adopted something called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DRIPA, which committed them to aligning provincial laws with the internationally recognized rights of Indigenous people. So for the BC Land Act, what's suggested is that for projects on Crown land that impact Indigenous people on their territories, those decisions would be made jointly. So the province would consult with First Nations for things that impact their land and their rights on that land.
Okay. Now, the argument that I hear from critics is that you're basically giving decision-making power or veto power of this 95% of BC's land to just 5% of the population. And so on the surface, it seems undemocratic or just not good. So what would your response be to that criticism?
Yeah. So, I mean, the word veto does not appear in the proposed changes.
They just made that up?
Yes. I don't want to accuse anyone of making anything up, but they're definitely saying something that is not in there.
Okay.
They're saying many things that are not in there. So joint decision making is very different from veto. A veto is like you say, would you like to have burgers for dinner? I might propose something else. But if I say, no, we're not having burgers ever, you're never getting a burger again. That's a veto. Joint decision making is a discussion. And I think most people would agree that consultation and engagement are important parts of the democratic process. So, for instance, if the government was proposing to put a mine next to your house, you might expect...
I would want a veto, to be honest.
But you would expect at the very least a little consultation, even though, that's something that mine might benefit the entire province. And you're just one person. Like, why should you even have a say in that? So I think most people understand the idea of consultation engagement when it affects them. We see this in Vancouver all the time. When there's proposed developments, the local neighborhood wants to be consulted. And so for something that's impacting a First Nation on their traditional territories, where they have expertise and understanding of the land that goes back thousands of years, their understanding of what might be impacted by that is very relevant and arguably in the interests of everybody in the province. Things that are being proposed anywhere in the province that might benefit you could also harm you in the long run. So we're seeing, environmental degradation from many industrial projects. So I think that, people understand the concept of engagement when it applies to them. And it's a very similar concept here. I think it's been blown out of proportion in a very interesting and strategic way, calling it an assault on private property rights.
And we'll get into that. But one thing that I've heard from industry is that the most uncertainty is actually around land claim issues. And so these proposed changes would help expedite that and basically industry would benefit from knowing the certainty of a project, whether they can do a project, a natural resources project in an area or not. So it would actually cut down on time spent in court with legal challenges. Is that a fair assessment of what these proposed land, proposed land changes to the Land Act are actually trying to accomplish?
Certainly. I mean, I think they're attempting to accomplish a couple of things, but one of them is definitely, an understanding that Indigenous rights and title are real concrete things in this country. There have been many legal cases that demonstrate that Aboriginal title exists, and that First Nations have rights on their lands. So generally speaking, when the First Nations go to court because their rights on their land are not being respected or upheld, they tend to win because the Canadian courts recognize that those rights are real. So there have been many cases where First Nations have sued, have obstructed development on their lands, and it does create a lot of uncertainty. It creates, also a lot of impacts for people in British Columbia, in Canada, who, as the taxpayers are paying the government's legal fees to fight First Nations in court.
Let's talk about the impacts for me.
Yes.
I've outed myself.
As the most important person here.
I've outed myself as a homeowner. John Rustad has said that this is a direct assault on private property rights. I have private property. Am I in trouble because of these proposed changes?
Yes, absolutely. The First Nations are coming to kick you off.
I
land.
knew it.
But I think that's the fear he's trying to speak to.
Right.
So in the proposed changes to the Land Act, which anyone can look up, it does not apply to private property.
Oh, it doesn't. Very clearly, it does not.
It doesn't.
Okay.
The other thing that, has been brought up is the Haida Agreement, which gives the Haida Nation control over what was formerly Crown land and is recognized as the Haida Nation's land. 98% of that was formerly Crown land, 2% is privately owned. In the Haida Agreement, you can read it says that the agreement does not apply to private property. So this is spelled out. It's quite clear. I would love to know what John Rustad is reading that makes him think it's an assault on private property rights. It applies only to public, what we call Crown land, even though it's relevant here that in BC, most land was not ceded to the Crown at any point.
Yeah.
Because most of BC, there were no treaties signed with First Nations. So that's title that, was never ceded to the Crown, unlike in areas where there were treaties signed where First Nations did, sign over land to the Crown. And in many of those places where treaties have not been upheld, those First Nations are also taking the government to court. In BC, First Nations are actually in a stronger position because their title is recognized here and they never ceded it. So, when we say Crown land, we should probably be saying unceded First Nations land in most cases.
Right. We have about 30 seconds left, so you might have to summarize this next question. Why did the BC NDP kick this down the road for after the election? Because what you described, it just seems like you're just adding more clarity to land title issues in the province. Yeah.
So I think the NDP have fumbled the ball a little bit by not explaining why these changes are being made, why they are in the best interest of British Columbians who probably don't want to see, their tax-paying dollars spent on fighting First Nations in court and losing. But they have sort of ceded the argument to Conservatives who have turned this into a pretty racist and inflammatory talking point that plays to the fears of people who think that First Nations are kind of out to get them for whatever reason. And they've not done a very good job explaining to the public why this is in everybody's best interest. Reconciliation isn't a zero-sum game. It benefits everybody when our natural resources are stewarded appropriately, when they're cared for by the original caretakers of the land. That is in everybody's best interest. And I think the NDP should do a better job of explaining that. Michelle, always a pleasure chatting with you. We need to do this more often. So please come back this season. I'd love to. All right. Thanks so much. Thank you. Folks, that was a senior editor for the Narwhal, Michelle Cyca. Thank you so much to Pacific Sands Beach Resort in Tofino for supporting local conversations about our local land. Now, after some business, BC Conservative leader John Rustad is on Jordan Peterson's podcast this week, and JJ McCullough will explain if this will impact our provincial election. Up next.